It started like any other welfare check, a simple request to check on a woman who was clearly in crisis. But what happened on that fateful day, September 16, 2024, would leave one life lost and another forever changed. The Bodycam footage would later reveal the full, terrifying confrontation. A confrontation that turned an ordinary moment into a life-or-death struggle in a matter of seconds. But before we begin, I want to thank you, my amazing viewers and subscribers, for your support through your likes, shares, and comments. Your engagements help make these stories more meaningful. If you're new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts. Sydney Wilson was a woman who seemed to have it all: a bright future, a strong career, and the kind of presence that made people take notice. Born in Pennsylvania, she moved to Washington, D.C., where her talent for basketball became undeniable. Standing over 6 feet tall, Sydney was a natural on the court. She wasn't just a player, she was a leader, the captain of the Georgetown University women's basketball team, a role that spoke volumes about her character and dedication. Her success wasn't limited to sports alone. Sydney was driven by a deep sense of responsibility to give back. She had a strong passion for community work, especially with young girls who dreamed of following in her footsteps. She mentored them, coached them, and shared the wisdom she had gained throughout her basketball career. Her efforts went beyond the court. She believed in empowering others, in helping them find their own voices, and in encouraging them to aim higher. Her academic life reflected the same level of commitment. Sydney wasn't just another athlete on scholarship. She earned her bachelor's degree from Georgetown University, balancing the demanding schedule of a student athlete with a commitment to excellence in her studies. She received an award for community service excellence in 2013, something she wore with pride. Her LinkedIn profile reflected a woman who understood the value of hard work, both on and off the court. "A personal goal of mine in 2024 is not to be humble," she wrote in one post. "I do a lot of really great and noteworthy work, and I am responsible for being my best advocate." But under the surface, things weren't always as perfect as they appeared. While Sydney was known for her positive attitude, her drive, and her compassion, there were signs, small, often unnoticed, that something was shifting. Over time, her mental health struggles began to emerge, not in any overt or dramatic way, but in subtle changes. The once vibrant woman who had taken pride in her accomplishments seemed increasingly distant. The pressures of life, of balancing so many responsibilities, began to weigh on her in ways that no one truly saw coming. She had always been the one to inspire others, but now there were moments where it was clear she was struggling with her own battles that she kept hidden from those closest to her. In 2024, Sydney even posted on LinkedIn about receiving a certificate in mental health first aid after completing an 8-hour training course. It was something she was proud of. After all, she had always cared deeply about others' well-being. But what wasn't mentioned in the post was how, in some ways, she might have needed the help herself. Her mental state deteriorated further in the months leading up to that fateful day. Friends and family would later recall the shifts in her behavior, how she started to feel more isolated, how she began to pull away. The confidence she once projected seemed to fade, replaced by something more frantic, more urgent. By September, those around her started to notice a woman in crisis, though it was clear to few just how severe it had become. This wasn't just about a rough patch, it was a downward spiral that no one seemed able to stop. As much as Sydney had worked hard to build a life that others admired, her struggles intensified, and what seemed like a series of manageable setbacks soon gave way to something darker, Mental health, as it often does, can be unpredictable. In the middle of this internal battle, everything would change. The downward turn reached a breaking point on the morning of September 16th, 2024, a day that started like any other, but would end with a tragedy no one could have anticipated. Officer Peter Liu had seen his fair share of high-stress situations over his 14 years on the force. A seasoned veteran, he was known for his calm demeanor, even in the most chaotic of moments. Trained in crisis intervention, Liu had dealt with everything from routine traffic stops to intense, life-threatening encounters. His ability to think clearly under pressure had earned him the trust of his colleagues and supervisors. He was the officer they called when things got tough, when things got unpredictable. That morning, like many others, Liu was ready for whatever might come his way. At 10:17 a.m., he was called and given a new assignment. It was another welfare check, a simple request from a mental health professional concerned about a woman in crisis. The woman's name was Sydney Wilson, and though she was described as mentally unwell, the call seemed routine enough. Liu had responded to dozens of these calls before. They were often straightforward. Show up, make sure everything was okay, check on the person's well-being, and leave. Sometimes it would be a false alarm, sometimes not, but it was part of the job. But there was something different this time. Normally, Officer Liu would be accompanied by a co-responder, a mental health clinician who helped assess the situation and de-escalate tensions. These co-responders had become a vital part of the process, offering the expertise to manage individuals in mental health crises. However, on this day, the co-responder was unavailable, responding to another call. It would be just Officer Liu. Officer Liu stood at the door of the apartment, his hand resting on the door frame as he knocked. The silence that followed was unusual, but there was something else. A faint sound of music coming from inside. It was an odd backdrop, considering the tense nature of the call. Liu knocked again, louder this time, calling out to Sydney. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. For a fleeting moment, Officer Liu saw Sydney Wilson's face, staring at him through the narrow gap. She looked at him for a second, then without warning, slammed the door shut. Liu wasn't surprised. It wasn't the first time someone had closed the door on him. He stepped back, glanced at the door, and then raised his hand to knock again. 2 minutes passed, 2 minutes of waiting in silence then, as though by instinct, the door opened again. Sydney opened the door with a calm expression, but as Officer Liu stood there, she raised a knife. Without any warning, she swung it at him. "Jesus Christ, back up!" Officer Liu shouted, stepping back, trying to put distance between himself and Sydney. He moved to the side, but Sydney was relentless. She didn't stop, didn't back away. Instead, she advanced, knife raised. Liu backed into a corner of the hallway, the space behind him too narrow for him to retreat further. He called out again, trying to reason with her, but his words did nothing to slow her advance. The officer felt his options running out. He had tried everything to calm the situation. His training told him to keep a safe distance, to de-escalate, but Sydney wasn't listening. She wasn't stopping. He could see the intent in her eyes now. She wasn't just confused, she was focused, determined, and moving forward. He realized there was no more room to retreat. He needed to act. Sydney took another step closer, raising the knife above her head. Officer Liu, feeling trapped, knew he had no choice but to defend himself. He pulled his weapon, his hands steady, despite the rising panic inside him. "Please, just stop," Liu pleaded, but Sydney's expression didn't change. She lunged at him again, swinging the knife in a wide arc. The officer fired, the sound of the gunshot breaking the silence that had filled the apartment hallway. He fired again, and then a third time. Sydney Wilson collapsed to the ground, the knife slipping from her hand. The struggle was over. The room was silent now. Officer Liu stood over her, his gun still in his hand, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. His breath came in shallow gasps. He didn't know how long he stood there, staring at the woman he had just shot, but it felt like an eternity. Officer Liu grabbed his radio to call for backup, but as he did, he felt the blood from his face begin to pour, staining his uniform. Within moments, the radio was covered in his own blood, making it hard to even hold it steady. Despite his injuries, he managed to call for help before he approached Sydney. Blood continued to pour from his face as he moved toward her. Sydney was still alive, her breath shallow, but she wasn't responding. Officer Liu asked, "Are you okay?" But there was no answer. Only faint, labored breathing could be heard as she clung to life, the blood loss making it clear she was in critical condition. Liu sank to the ground, his vision blurred, struggling to stay upright. Neighbors from the apartment complex started to emerge, looking on in confusion and concern, asking if everything was okay. The scene was chaotic, but help was on its way. Officers and medics soon arrived. Body camera footage captured the moment Officer Liu collapsed to the ground, his face bloodied, the reality of the situation setting in. Medics quickly began treating his wounds, though the scene was horrific. The footage ended with Liu still on the ground as medics worked on him. Sydney Wilson was rushed to the hospital, but she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Officer Liu, though severely wounded, would survive. His injuries, though serious, were not life-threatening, and he was treated for his wounds. Now, the footage from the scene will be played. Please, do note that it is very graphic. You're advised to skip it if you can't watch it.
Back up. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Hey man, I'm also doing. Please back up. Oh yeah. Back up. Oh, yeah. Back up. Back up. Back up.
Was that the knife she had?
Yeah.
Okay. Once again, you're not cut anywhere. Where's she shot?
Multiple times. Upper torso.
Upper torso.
I might have shot her in the head, but I'm not sure.
A graphic image of Officer Liu's head wound has circulated online, showing the extent of the injury he sustained during the confrontation. As word of the incident spread, the community began to divide. Some mourned Sydney's death, remembering her as a once promising woman who had fallen victim to an apparent mental health crisis. The tragedy of her life, ending so violently, resonated with many who felt for her family and friends. But there were others who defended Officer Liu. They argued that he had acted in self-defense, that he had been left with no choice but to use lethal force when Sydney charged at him with a knife. They saw his actions as justified, given the circumstances. For some, Sydney's death was the result of a broken system, a mental health crisis that had gone out of control without the proper support. For others, it was simply the tragic outcome of a dangerous confrontation, with a police officer who had been forced to defend himself. The question on everyone's mind was simple, yet complex. Was Officer Liu's response justified? A criminal investigation was launched immediately. It would examine the details of the shooting, the officer's actions, and the circumstances surrounding Sydney's mental state. The investigation would scrutinize whether the use of deadly force was appropriate, or if other methods, such as a taser or de-escalation techniques, could have prevented Sydney's death. Chief Kevin Davis of the Fairfax County Police Department addressed the media, acknowledging the difficulty of these types of situations. "These are not decisions that anyone takes lightly," he said. "When an officer's life is in danger, they are trained to make decisions in split seconds, to act fast and protect themselves. It is a difficult job, and these are difficult decisions." Davis also mentioned that, as part of standard procedure, Officer Liu had been placed on restricted duty while the investigation was underway. This was a normal part of the process, but it didn't stop the speculation and concern surrounding the officer's future.
Things that we train him and expect him to do. If you're threatened like that, if you can tactically reposition yourself, do it. If you can use distance, use it. If you can seek cover and concealment, seek it. All those options just weren't available to him, and he was being simultaneously attacked.
The co-responder program, which usually involved a mental health clinician accompanying officers on calls involving mental health crises, was also called into question. Could a clinician have helped de-escalate the situation? Many felt that if a mental health professional had been present, the outcome might have been different. The absence of the co-responder, due to the clinician being on another call, was a key point in the debate that followed. As the investigation unfolded, the public became more polarized. The community was sharply divided. On one side, people defended Officer Liu's actions, standing firm in the belief that he had no choice but to protect himself. On the other, there were those who questioned whether the shooting was necessary at all, pointing out the role of mental health crises in incidents like this, and raising concerns about whether the use of deadly force was too extreme. Amidst all the debate, one thing was clear. This incident had exposed deeper questions about policing, mental health support, and the need for better systems to handle people in crisis. Whether Officer Liu's actions would be deemed justified or not, the fallout would leave lasting effects on everyone involved. When Georgetown University's women's basketball team posted a tweet mourning the death of Sydney Wilson, it seemed like a simple gesture of respect for a former player. The tweet read, "Georgetown women's basketball mourns the tragic loss of Sydney Wilson. Forever, a Hoya." On the surface, it was just a tribute, a way to honor someone who had once been a part of the team. But the timing of the post and the lack of context surrounding Sydney's death sparked immediate backlash. The tweet came out just days after Sydney's tragic death, but there was no mention of the events that led to her demise, no acknowledgement of the deadly confrontation with Officer Liu. This omission didn't sit well with many. To them, it felt like Georgetown was mourning Sydney, without fully recognizing the circumstances that surrounded her death, which only fueled public outrage. Why was the team sharing a tribute without any mention of the violence that had unfolded? The silence on such a sensitive issue seemed callous to some. As the tweet spread, the criticism began to grow. People accused the university of insensitivity, pointing out the disconnect between the celebration of her life and the reality of how she had died. Georgetown's failure to address the details of the incident, specifically the tragic confrontation with the police, left many feeling like they were turning a blind eye to the seriousness of the situation. The tweet, intended to honor Sydney, instead felt like an attempt to bypass uncomfortable questions. The criticism didn't stop at the university's actions. As the story gained traction, another layer of controversy emerged: race. Some people suggested that Sydney's death had been treated differently because she was black. The narrative of racial discrimination took hold quickly, as many began to argue that if Sydney had been a white woman, the situation might have played out differently. Some believed she might have been tased or dealt with more cautiously instead of being shot. The debate grew louder, with many pointing out that race often played a role in how these confrontations with police unfolded. But the conversation took a more complex turn when people started drawing comparisons to other cases and tried to disprove the racial claims. One such case was that of Leah Baker, an American lady who, in a similar situation, was shot after charging at police with a knife. But unlike Sydney, Baker's death involved even more brutality. In her case, the police dog was also used to subdue her, and her body was left severely injured, with her intestines hanging out after the altercation. Despite the horrific nature of both incidents, some argued that Baker's treatment was even more extreme, though the circumstances were remarkably similar to Sydney's. As the public debated the fairness of police actions in these cases, it became clear that the issue wasn't just about Sydney's death. It was about a larger, much more complex conversation surrounding race, law enforcement, and how these kinds of encounters are handled in America. As the details of Sydney Wilson's tragic death unfold, there are many lingering questions that remain unanswered. Could this incident have been avoided? Was there a better way to handle this welfare check? Could the presence of a co-responder, a mental health professional, have changed the outcome? And what if Officer Liu had made a different decision, acted more quickly, or been provided with a different set of circumstances? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, in the end, who's truly to blame for this tragedy? This tragedy is a stark reminder that we all make choices, sometimes in a split second, that can change everything. And, in the end, it's the decisions we make, whether as individuals or as a society, that can determine the course of events. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments. If this story left an impact on you, there are more chilling cases like it on the channel. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video to help ensure these stories are never forgotten. Thanks for watching,